Well, hello, welcome back to another episode of Wade's Year-By-Year Flashback. And this time we're looking at the second half of 1981. So, events, be they global, political, or cultural, that occurred between July and December of 1981. And why did I pick 1981 as the first year that I'm looking at? Well, because it was the year that I was born. So, how about that? And we're starting off this time with July of 1981. Let's look at July 7th. So, on that date, Sandra Day O'Connor's nomination was a big event. She was nominated to fill the vacancy left by retiring Justice Potter Stewart, who you never seem to hear about. And in fact, you don't really hear that much about Sandra Day O'Connor herself either, to be honest. But anyway, she fulfilled a campaign promise by Ronald Reagan to appoint the first woman to the High Court, and she was confirmed unanimously 99 to 0 by the Senate in September. So on July 9th, we had Donkey Kong's release. Yes, designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, this game was a massive gamble for a struggling Nintendo of America, which actually was a company that existed since the 1800s. A lot of people don't know that, but that was actually something that I was reminded about during trivia night once, and I was like, oh yeah, Nintendo's actually a pretty old company. But anyway, Donkey Kong he popularized the platformer genre and introduced Jumpman, who was later renamed Mario, and became one of the highest grossing arcade games of all time. And of course, a lot of people know who Mario is or Donkey Kong is. They don't need to have played the game. I mean, I think plenty of people know who these characters are. There's now some successful movies out based on Mario, and it's just an iconic video game character, iconic franchise, and Donkey Kong is loved in its own right. All right, moving on to July 10th, you have the Handsworth and UK riots, a toxic mix of high unemployment, racial tensions, and aggressive police tactics that triggered massive civil unrest across some major English cities. And, it seems like not everything has changed since then, right? So, looking at July 17th, the Hyatt Regency walkway collapse. During a crowded tea dance party, two interconnected skywalks loaded with spectators tore from their ceiling rods and crashed into the lobby. Investigators discovered a last minute design change had inadvertently doubled the load on the support beams, leading to a massive overhaul of American engineering ethics and quality control. So, with that one, a number of people died, and you don't hear that much about this event either. But every time you have a tragedy like this, um, it's going to become a historical footnote for sure. The way things go, you're going to have events like these stacked on top of each other, and it's kind of tricky to remind them all or remember them all. Remind them all, Jesus Christ. But remember them all. But 114 people died in this, and it's still considered one of the deadliest structural failures in U.S. history. So let's move on to July 29. That was the royal wedding date, dubbed a fairy tale wedding. The ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral was an international media spectacle. You had the marriage between, who was that? Oh, yes, Lady Diana Spencer and Prince Charles. It drew a global TV audience of over 750 million people, so it was definitely watched by a heck of a lot of people. And uh, Diana had a massive popularity, and there were massive street parties across the UK, and the sheer scale of the global broadcast made it one of the defining cultural milestones of the 1981 zeitgeist. And zeitgeist is a fun word, so I might use that on occasion as I proceed through this podcast. So, July 30th, around 50,000 protesters, mostly women and children, take to the streets in Todd's, Poland. I'm not sure how that name is pronounced. But anyway, in Poland, to demonstrate against severe food rations shortages under the communist regime. This was amid staggering economic mismanagement by the communist government. Everyday grocery staples like meat, butter, and sugar were strictly rationed, and the massive peaceful march, led largely by mothers pushing strollers, became a potent visual symbol of the citizens' growing defiance. So, for those of you out there who are right wingers who are going to say, "Oh, you're nothing but a communist," like, no, no, no. I've right here made fun of in so many ways, or at least acknowledged a failing communist regime. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. And note that I can criticize right wing governments and criticize left wing governments. How about that? It's not like it's a polar opposite where you can only criticize one and love the other. There's a possibility of criticizing multiple different approaches to government. I know, what a fanciful concept. Let's move on to August 1981. On August 1st, MTV, aka Music Television, well, at least that's what it was called at first, it officially launches in the United States, playing its very first music video, Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles. MTV launches aimed at teenagers, and the channel is said to have revolutionized both the music and television industries. And I think that's a fair thing to say. They certainly changed the music industry big time. The fact is that if you were a band and you got on MTV back in the day, you might be having a good time, because that they were sort of like kingmakers. And in fact, Beavis and Butthead were themselves said to be kingmakers. And it's funny to think about that, but it's kind of true. Of course, Nirvana is said to have killed off hair metal as a genre. MTV helped popularize rap music. And, I'll give some credit to MTV for being innovative at times. They actually did sometimes boost alternative rock. And I don't just mean like, the mainstream alternative, as it was called, like Alanis Morissette, who I barely even would consider alternative anyway. But they would have even bands like the Butthole Surfers on, and so on and so forth. So they actually did take some chances, despite Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys saying that MTV needs to get off the air, and their song similarly titled. Nevertheless, they took some chances, but of course, MTV would go on to die with a whimper. And what's really sad about it is that, in my opinion, they could have actually still had plenty of music on there, and also a good chunk of reality TV, as it was called. You could do both of those hypothetically, but MTV, they just chose to obsess over reality TV, as that was called. And a lot of the people who originally wanted to see music, they just were like, okay, we're not going to watch this anymore. And it started to get so pathetic that at a certain point, I was at least wanting them to even play more pop music. And I'm not the world's biggest pop music fan by any stretch of the imagination. But it was really quite a sad thing that they basically chose to fall apart, and they ended with a whimper. There was very little even talk about it. even though MTV was kind of a big deal back in the 80s, 90s, and a little bit of the early 2000s still. But there was actually very little to be said about it, apparently, in mainstream media. But anyway, its first words spoken by co creator John Lack were "Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll." And that's interesting too, because that was a sign that they were considered part of the rock era. Remember that? Yeah, I do too. That's basically my favorite genre of music overall. I'm more into rock than, pop or rap. Although I did get accustomed to rap, because there were some rap music groups and individual rappers, that I couldn't deny that some of that stuff was good. Like, even like the people who were racist against rappers at first, some of them might say, okay, the Beastie Boys are all right, because let's face it, uh, racism kind of helped the Beastie Boys out a little bit. I know that's probably a controversial thing to say, but I think it's true. I heard it from people myself, people who I grew up with, who were like a little bit dismissive of rap music because of the racial component. Um, but some of those people were seeing the Beastie Boys as a bit of a gateway drug, and eventually some of them would go on to, listen to non-white rappers as well. So yeah, it was also people like Ice-T, Public Enemy, and Digital Underground. Um, you know, uh, uh, the Insane in the Membrane, Cypress Hill, Jump Around, a bunch of other rappers that I couldn't help but like, and that kind of helped me get into rap a little bit more, even though it's still not my favorite genre. In fact, I even prefer industrial music over rap, but sometimes I still listen to rap here and there. And man, I'm probably getting sidetracked here, but I guess that's kind of the point, looking back and seeing what these individual events make me think about. So anyway, MTV shifted how music was marketed and consumed globally. That much you can't deny. Although again, they went out with a pretty sad and pathetic little whimper. All right, moving on to August 3rd, over 11,500 members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO, go on strike in the U.S. for better pay and working conditions. The PATCO strike saw the union representing federal air traffic controllers seeking a 32-hour work week and better retirement benefits. Because they were federal employees, the strike was said to violate a law banning strikes against the government, triggering a massive national aviation crisis. And why does that sound relevant to what's going on nowadays? I don't know. Boy, I have no idea. But anyway, on August 3rd, or no, on August 5th, like 2 days later, following their refusal to return to work, President Reagan fulfills his ultimatum and begins firing the 11,500 striking air traffic controllers, permanently banning them from federal service. The firing uh, happened because Reagan viewed the strike as an illegal threat to national safety. When the 48-hour return to work grace period expired, he fired the workers and used military controllers to keep commercial flights moving. The move effectively crushed PATCO and severely weakened the broader American labor movement for decades. So, way to go, Reagan, you dick. you know, I obviously am not the biggest fan of Ronald Reagan, and this is one of the stupid things that he did. So, no friend of workers in my book. He could have just pressured the government to meet their demands, and they would have easily went back to work. Okay, on August 13th, President Reagan signs the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 into law, implementing massive across the board cuts in federal income taxes. So the Economic Recovery Tax Act, it was the cornerstone of Reaganomics. It cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 50% and slashed corporate taxes, operating under the supply side economic theory that tax cuts would stimulate historic business investment. So, yeah, we've seen the miracle of Reaganomics in all the years since then, because there have been, some versions of it throughout the years in the United States, from president to president. And August 19th, the Gulf of Sidra accident occurs when two U.S. Navy F 14 Tomcats shoot down two Libyan Sukhoi Su 22 fighter jets after being fired upon over international waters claimed by Libya. The Gulf of Sidra incident involved Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, who declared the entire Gulf of Sidra to be Libyan territory, a claim the U.S. rejected. So, during a naval exercise testing this boundary, two Libyan jets locked onto U.S. fighters. The Americans turned and shot them down in a brief high stakes dogfight. Fun stuff, fun stuff. So, let's look at August 24th. All right, so on August 24th, Mark David Chapman is sentenced to 20 years to life in prison for the December 1980 murder of music icon John Lennon. Chapman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder despite his lawyers attempting to enter an insanity plea. At his sentencing, he read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye before being sent to prison, where he has been repeatedly denied parole ever since. September 1981, moving on to the next month. On September 18th, France officially abolishes capital punishment, eliminating the use of the guillotine, or guillotine as some people pronounce it, under President Francois Mitterrand. So France abolishes the guillotine, and Minister of Justice Robert Badinter, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but anyway, that Minister of Justice led the charge under President Mitterrand to end capital punishment. The last execution in France had occurred just 4 years earlier in 1977, making this the official end of the guillotine's 2-century legacy. So now, at least supposedly, if you've got your head on the chopping block in France, that's probably going to be more figurative than literal, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, September 21st, Belize gains full independence from the United Kingdom, ending its status as a British Crown colony previously known as British Honduras. So, Belize independence, after decades of delays, largely caused by neighboring Guatemala claiming sovereignty over the territory, the former colony of British Honduras finally achieved the full independence that it sought, though British troops remained for years to guarantee its borders, or at least that's what they were claiming they were up to. So, September 26th, the Boeing 767 or 767, the wide body commercial airliner, makes its maiden flight in Everett, Washington. So, developed alongside the 757, the twin engine 767 was designed to be incredibly fuel efficient during a time of skyrocketing oil prices, and went on to become the standard aircraft for transatlantic travel. So, how about that? Moving right along to October 3rd of 1981, the grueling 1981 Irish hunger strike at HM Prison Maze in Northern Ireland. What a name, Prison Maze. Um, anyway, uh, the strike ends after 7 months and the deaths of 10 Republican prisoners, including Bobby Sands. Irish hunger strike, it's not something that many people bring up these days. I don't hear about it. But the protest at Mays Prison was a bid by Republican prisoners to be treated as political prisoners rather than common criminals. It ended after those 10 men starved to death, and the high profile deaths radicalized nationalist politics and propelled Sinn Féin into mainstream electoral politics. So I'm probably mispronouncing Sinn Féin as well. Um, you can correct me in the comments. And October 6th saw Egyptian President Anwar Sadat assassinated during a military victory parade in Cairo by members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Anwar Sadat was targeted primarily because he signed the 1979 Camp David Accords, making Egypt the first Arab nation to recognize Israel. So, during the military parade celebrating the Yom Kippur War, a group of soldiers pulled a truck out of line and opened fire on the VIP stands. Hmm. So, yeah, that happened. October 14th, Vice President Hosni Mubarak, I've heard it pronounced different ways, is officially elected president of Egypt following the assassination of Anwar Sadat. Hosni Mubarak takes power, and he was sitting right next to Sadat during the assassination and suffered a hand injury. So I did not know that before I looked into this. And he was swiftly confirmed as president. He established a strict state of emergency and would rule Egypt for the next 30 years until the 2011 Arab Spring. Remember that? You don't hear that much about that either anymore. What about November 1981? Well, in November 12th, NASA launches the Space Shuttle Columbia, making or marking the first time in history a manned reusable spacecraft is launched into space for a second time. So, this mission proved the core concept of the Space Shuttle program, that a spacecraft could land like an airplane, be refurbished, and fly safely into orbit again. It, it drastically changed how humanity viewed space logistics. So I just took a drink of water there. My throat's getting a little bit sore. And what about November 23rd? Well, then President Reagan signs National Security Decision Directive 17, secretly authorizing the CIA to recruit, train, and fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua to oppose the Sandinista government. So, this highly classified directive authorized $19 million in initial funding for the CIA to build an anti Sandinista paramilitary force. It set off a brutal proxy war in Central America and laid the covert groundwork for what would later blow up into the Iran Contra affair. So, let's also consider that November 26, 1981, that was my birthday. So that's obviously a big event in my life. It was when I was born. Alright, moving on to December of 1981. Basically, the final stretch of the year and this episode. So on December 1st, you had the INEX Andrea Aviopromet flight. And it was a flight that crashed in Corsica, France, tragically killing all 180 passengers and crew on board. December 11th, the El Mazote massacre takes place in El Salvador, where army units slaughter over 900 civilians during the Salvadoran Civil War. In the El Mazote massacre, it was a brutal anti guerrilla campaign, and the U.S. trained Atlactol Battalion entered the village of El Mazote and systematically tortured and executed its civilian inhabitants. The event remains one of the worst atrocities in modern Latin American history, and yes, it was uh, backed by U.S. trained a battalion trained by the United States. So I'm sure that makes you feel all nice and warm inside. Let's look at another event from December 13th. General Wojciech Jaruzelski declares martial law in Poland, banning the Solidarity Trade Union and arresting thousands of political activists to suppress the anti communist movement. So it's basically martial law in Poland to crush the rise of the Solidarity movement, the first non communist trade union in the Soviet bloc. The military government cut phone lines, deployed tanks to the streets, and locked up thousands of Union leaders overnight to prevent a feared Soviet military invasion. So, um, yeah, I don't really have anything to say about that. Anyway, moving on. December 14th, Israel officially annexes the Golan Heights, applying Israeli law and administration to the territory captured from Syria during the 1967 Six Day War. So, the annexation of the Golan Heights, by extending Israeli law, jurisdiction, and administration to the region, Israel effectively annexed the strategically vital plateau. The move was heavily condemned internationally and declared null and void by the UN Security Council. But that doesn't seem to have stopped Israel over the years. What about September 8th? Or no, not September, December 18th. That had legendary news anchor Tom Brokaw sign off from NBC's The Today Show for the last time before transitioning to anchor NBC Nightly News. So, not really that newsworthy in my opinion, but whatever. It was considered an event. And then, of course, you also had Christmas, Santa Claus. On December 25th, Santa Claus traveled around the globe with his omniscient powers, delivering all types of presents for, pretty well off boys and girls around the globe. Although, if you were on the poor side, you probably didn't get much. So, you can blame Santa Claus for that, presumably, rather than poverty. Anyway, those were the events for the year of 1981, including Santa failing some and being a very opportune presence for others. All right, let's look at the notable births of 1981, as far as like July through, October or December. Why did I say October? I don't know what the hell I'm thinking. But anyway, on July 7th, you had MS Dhoni, a legendary Indian cricket captain, was born. I don't know who that is, but I want to start off with the name that I'm probably butchering. We also had Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, Sussex, born on August 4th. She is, of course, an American actress and British royal family member. And I'm just gonna say it. She's a bit of a babe. There we go. I said it. You know, guilty as charged. I'm saying it. And Beyonce Knowles was born on September 4th, the American pop icon and a bit of a cultural phenomenon, and also kind of a babe too. Jennifer Hudson, the EGOT winning American singer and actress, also probably a babe, although I don't remember what she looks like offhand. Serena Williams, born on September 26th. She's a tennis star, 23-time Grand Slam winner. I'm sure she's attractive enough too. And did I say the birth date of Jennifer Hudson? Well, it's September 12th. I don't know if I said it. Kim Kardashian, born on October 21st in 1981. Of course, she's known for being a reality TV star and entrepreneur and being married to Kanye West before he was known as a black Nazi. Oh, here's a painful one to even say. Ivanka Trump, born on October 30th. She is, of course, the president's daughter. And, she's also an entrepreneur, businesswoman. She's sparking a revolution in Albania because they're rejecting her attempt to buy an island over there. And people are pissed off about that. So, in that sense, she is also a part of history. And, of course, you can watch plenty of videos about Donald Trump basically drooling over his own daughter, Ivanka. And, yeah, I don't know what to say about that, but go ahead and look those up. It's pretty gross how he treats his own daughter. Britney Spears was born on December 2nd, 1981. So I'm technically older than both. Oh, yeah, not both of them. But Ivanka Trump is just a little bit older than me, and I'm technically a little bit older than Britney Spears, apparently. But of course, everybody's heard of Britney Spears. She's a pop superstar or whatever, although she has pledged to not make any new music. Um, I guess she just doesn't want to do it anymore. What about the notable deaths of 1981? Well, Harry Chapin died on July 16th. He was an American folk rock singer-songwriter known for Cats in the Cradle. So he died again on July 16th. You had Albert Speer, who died on September 1st, the Nazi architect and Reich Minister of Armaments. So a piece of shit, basically. Anwar Sadat, I mentioned him earlier. He died on October 6th. He died, as president of Egypt, assassinated during a military parade. And let's see, who else do we have? William Holden, Oscar winning American actor, died on November 12th. He's known for Sunset Boulevard, which I must admit I still have not watched. Natalie Wood died on November 29th. She's known for acting in West Side Story, and she died in a mysterious drowning. So, yeah, I think I've only seen one movie where she was in, and it's like a thriller movie where she plays a blind person. I actually forget what it's called, but uh, I've seen one movie that she was in at least. And you have Hoagie Carmichael died on December 27th. He was an American composer and singer known for Stardust. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. I probably talked about MTV a little bit too much. Um, but that's because I was a pretty avid MTV watcher back in the day. And oddly enough, I'm not that ashamed to admit it. Because back then, it had some strengths, believe it or not. But anyway, this is the end of my look at 1981. I don't think I have more to say. Stay tuned because probably next week I'm going to be back with a look at 1982. And then I'm going to proceed. The next year after that will be 1983, then 84, 85. And I'll keep on going like that until I have to go backwards in time. So it's going to be like me splitting the year up into two different sections for each episode. because my voice gets too sore and froggy if I cover the entire year in one episode. So, all right. Hope you enjoyed it. I guess it doesn't matter much if you didn't. Feel free to like and subscribe. Blah, 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 blah. Have a good one.